Our topic today is the 6 Americas of Climate Change, Perceptions of Southeast Extension Professionals. And our presenters today are Dr. Martha Monroe. Martha is a professor in the School of Forest Resources and Conservation at University of Florida. She specializes in environmental education, conservation behavior, and the human dimensions of environmental issues. Within PineMap, she is the AIM 5 co-leader, an AIM 6 member, and an integration leader for education and extension. Overall, she works to understand perceptions and motives so that she can create programs and possibilities to nudge people towards sustainability. Her co-presenter is Damian Adams. Damian is an assistant professor of natural resource economics and policy at the University of Florida in the School of Forest Resources and Conservation as well. He's also a PineMap co-PI and co-leader of AIM 4, the Economic and Policy AIM. Damian's background is he holds a master's degree in environmental policy from the University of Cambridge, as well as a law degree and PhD in food and resource economics from Florida. His area of specialization is natural resource economics and policy with emphasis on invasive species, carbon sequestration, and water resources. And within the scope of PineMap he works on, and outside of the scope of PineMap, he works on ecosystem service values, attitudes, preferences, and laws, and uses survey methods, evaluation methods, bioeconomic modeling, and law policy analysis. Let's welcome Damian and Martha for the presentation. We look forward to a good webinar. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Leslie. Hope everybody can hear me okay. I'm not too loud or too quiet. If I am, just put a comment in the chat box, and I'll try to adjust. So first, I just want to recognize one of our additional co-authors here, which is Richard Plate, who is there he is. So he's also on the webinar with us, and he's been doing a fantastic job helping us look at the statistical significance of some of the factors that we think are driving these perceptions on climate change within extension. So Richard's here, and if Richard, if you see anything that you want to jump in on, please feel free to do so, and I know Martha will as well. And so what I'm going to do is just present sort of the first portion here. Once I get to the results, Martha's going to take over, and we'd like to keep this sort of fluid, with the idea that the purpose of this presentation is not just to deliver information to you, but also to use this as a sounding board to get some information back about how these results might influence your programs, whether it be in extension, AIM 6 members, or whether it be working with the industrial cooperators. So at the end, what we're going to do is pose some questions and really hope for some robust discussion. So as we're going through this, just try to think about how some of these results might influence what you do in your research and in your outreach and even your teaching programs. So with that, let me go ahead and just jump into the project. So what we did was we wanted to take a look at how those in extension viewed climate change, and an important component of PineMap is that outreach and extension component. Developing those materials that will enable both our non-industrial and our industrial forest landowners to do things in a different way that will help increase carbon sequestration and reduce nitrogen runoff, and hopefully achieve the goals of the project. And we know that as we roll out these and we develop these programs on forest management and climate variability, we're going to be relying on the troops in the field, the extension professionals, to both participate in these programs development, and also to be sort of the last mile of delivery for these. And so it's important that we understand their perceptions about climate change, because we feel like this is going to impact how we develop these programs, and the kind of strategy that we develop for implementing these programs. And so one thing I would just want to mention here is that this Six Americas of Climate Change Perceptions work was not in the original PineMap proposal. It actually flowed from a conversation that we had during the reverse site visit with Eric Norland. And so in many ways, this was his idea, suggesting that we take a look at how extension professionals think about this issue. And I'd also like to really recognize Martha for making the connection to the Six Americas work that was actually done by Ed Maybach at George Mason University with their Center for Climate Change Communication, and Anthony Lazarowitz at the Yale Project on Climate Change Communication, who developed the core of the questions that we used to be able to assess our respondents' perceptions on climate change. So really my role was pretty small. I think I was the one who said, hey, we can do this. I know how to implement a survey like this, and so I can help. But really, I think much of the kudos need to go to Martha and to Eric Norland, and also to Richard Plate, who's done such a fantastic job with the statistical analysis. So the basic questions that we had when putting this project together was, we wanted to know what it was that was driving the perceptions on climate change amongst the extension professionals in the Southeast, and we wanted to know what kind of specific factors we could identify that we feel like were driving these changes in perception. So things like what program area do they work on? What stakeholders do they work with? What location do they have? Are they near the coast? Are they in sort of Alabama versus North Carolina? Does that have an impact? What is their role within extension? Are they an extension agent? Are they an extension specialist or in administration? How many years have they got an extension? And what's their education level? Those sorts of things. So we wanted to figure out what those drivers were, and at the same time, given the focus of PineMap with its reliance on outreach and extension, we felt like it was important to also draw in some perceptions on what our respondents thought were the limitations of delivering these types of programming, these types of programs on climate change and related issues. So those are sort of the two major research questions that we have, and as you'll see, that kind of drives many of the questions that we included. So the Six Americas framework that we borrowed with permission, of course, was developed by a couple of researchers at George Mason University and Yale University, and over the past few years they've conducted several national studies on the public's perceptions on climate change, although I must caution that they actually use the term global warming, which we have a slide on in just a minute here. But what the framework does is, over a series of either 15 or 36 questions, depending on which one you use, it can sort respondents into one of 6 different categories based on their global warming views. Everything from being alarmed about climate change and global warming to being completely dismissive about climate change and global warming. And what you see here, the bubbles are in accordance with the percentages. So this is an example of the entire United States. I think it's from 2009. And what we see here is that about a third of the United States, the general public, are in the category of concerned about global warming. And you can see the distribution from there. So it's not. I would say if it's a uniform distribution, it's landed to it's somewhat skewed to the left. And so what we're hoping to find out is how well this matches up with what we see in extension as well. Does extension really look like what we see in the rest of the United States? So using the questions that were developed by Maybach and Lazarowitz, again, we wanted to be able to compare the results that we got to the rest of the United States, get a sense of what the distribution of these perceptions are on this important issue. And one thing to note is that in order to be able to use their framework, to be able to use the scale that they developed, so they developed two scales, a 15-item and a 36-item scale. Unfortunately, to retain the validity of the scales, we couldn't change any of their questions. So we were stuck with the global warming phrase really throughout these questions, and that was something that we knew through our pretest would cause some potential concerns. So Bill's got a question here. Was there the hypothesis that extension professionals would be different than the general public? I think we had sort of a naive hypothesis. We were interested in finding out if extension professionals were different from the general public. And when we started this project, we thought we would be able to make that direct comparison. And it turns out that we really weren't. Actually, I think, Bill, if you don't mind, let's hold this until after we present the results, and I think Martha will address this about the reason why we couldn't really make that comparison, that direct comparison. Oh, yeah, thanks, Bill. Okay,
yeah,
so
we could certainly,
yeah, go ahead.
if I could interrupt for a second.
Oh, sure, absolutely.
Extension faculty work at universities. They deliver science-based information as a part of their job. And so one could assume that these would be people who understand science and believe science and trust science and would at least be aware and concerned about climate change. And so in that respect, the hypothesis would be the extension faculty would not mirror the public and they would be more on the concerned and alarmed side. And that was the question. Are they the same as everybody else, or are they different?
Great, thanks, Martha. Yeah, that's very good explanation. So from my perspective, I would say I didn't really know. I could see sort of both sides. So we've got an cooperative extension service that we think is very similar to their stakeholders, and really that's one of the things that has been indicated as possibly leading to extension as being such a successful institution. And so if they're more like their stakeholders, and if their stakeholders hold views that are more distrusting of science and more dismissive of climate change, then that we think would lead the respondents to this survey to also be more distrusting of science and dismissive of climate change. So they would be more on the right side of the distribution, which is less concerned about climate change. On the other hand, as Martha indicated, these are professionals whose jobs really can be summed up as they take science out to their stakeholders. They turn it into sort of digestible pieces of information that the lay audience can understand. And so we would think that given their work with science, and we would hope their appreciation of science, that that would have sort of a contradictory effect to the one I just mentioned. And again, when we get to the results, I think there's going to be some interesting discussion about that. Okay, so let me just move on. So we had a pilot test of this, and we were able to, with the responses that we got, make some adjustments to the survey. The pretest had comment boxes, and so we got some rather colorful comments in some cases, and there was a concern about perceived bias with the way the Six Americas questions, those core questions that we borrowed, the way they used the global warming term, and the way that they phrase some of the questions that are maybe a little differently phrased than what we would expect in your typical sort of extension program. For example, there was a question, if I'm recalling correctly, I think it was in the 15-item scale, it might have been 36, that something to the effect of, I routinely punish companies for their lack of work on climate change. I'm completely phrasing here, but that was one of those questions that raised some concerns. So we explained the benefits of using these questions, and ultimately in the final instrument, we had, in addition to the explanation of why we needed to use these questions, we also included a definition of global warming and climate change, and I believe also climate variability. And we had questions. Let me just forward. So we had questions that we added to the survey. Some of them we put in there. We call them lightning rod questions that allowed people to sort of vent about any perceived bias that they saw in the Six Americas questions. And others were questions that were things that we really wanted to collect data on. For example, their perceptions of any kind of barriers related to delivering climate change programming. But our questions incorporated a broader definition of global warming, climate change, and climate variability, particularly when we were looking at programming. So again, the Six Americas questions were about global warming. The reason why we think this wasn't really a problem is because global warming being more narrow in its supposed sort of reasons why it's happening, global warming really does narrow the focus to a man-made event, as opposed to natural oscillations in the climate. So we felt like this would give us a clearer sense of sort of the motivations and the perceptions regarding global warming and climate change. So the process that we followed, it was the Don Dillman process, which I think those of you that work in survey work are intimately familiar with. And so using the Dillman process, we modified it, and what we ended up doing was contacting extension colleagues in all of the southeastern states to see if they were interested in helping with the survey, and asking them if they were interested to sort of lobby their extension administrators on our behalf. And what we needed from them was a contact list that included email addresses and names of all of the extension professionals, all of the faculty. So anybody involved with extension, and these lists included everybody from staff, non-tenure track faculty, tenure track faculty, extension agents, and so forth. It was an extensive list that we got from the states that were ultimately involved. We asked the colleagues to help us get approval from the extension administrators to really use their name and their emails on all of the communications, which we felt, and according to the Dillman methodology, we felt that would increase more buy-in with the survey and increase response rates. And we also had the extension administrators on our behalf send a couple of emails that help promote the survey, one introductory email and then a reminder email. Ultimately, what we included was a series of communications that we tried to make as personal as possible, but it was all done through SurveyMonkey, so all electronic, and we handled all of the implementation of the survey and the data analysis. And at this point, we're finishing up the data analysis and making both the raw data and the analysis available to those that collaborated with us in those states. We ended up with 8 states in total that participated. So there were several states that declined, either because their extension administrators didn't feel comfortable sharing the lists, which included email addresses, which of course raises some privacy concerns, or because they simply felt like the issue of climate change and global warming was one that would ruffle too many feathers, which was the case. Well, actually, I'd rather not say where, but that was the case at least a couple of places. So we ended up with Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Mississippi, North Carolina, Texas, Virginia, and Louisiana, and we endeavored to include both the 1890 land grants and the 1862 land grants, so that we had really full coverage of the folks that participated in extension. And we ended up with very good response rates. As it turns out, following the Dillman method does increase, I can't say ensure good response rates, but every time I've used it, it has worked fairly well. And so the lowest response rate that we got was from Louisiana, and even that was almost 60%, and the highest one was from Georgia at almost 80%. So we had a fantastic response rate, and Martha and I wrote up a paper that's forthcoming in Journal of Extension, just talking about using using these electronic survey methods and the Dillman implementation process to boost response rates. And because we had such a great response rate, we felt like we didn't have issues with coverage bias, which is something that otherwise we'd have to test for, but we still had a concern with non-response bias, where you get folks that don't respond for strategic purposes. For example, they don't like the topic of the survey. They feel like global warming is not important, that sort of thing. So we used a pretty standard approach of contacting the non-respondents either by email or phone, and asking them a series of questions to evaluate whether or not there were strategic reasons why they were avoiding the survey. And we found out that no, in fact, very, very few of the people indicated that they didn't like the survey topic, that it was more that they were too busy, or they hadn't received the link, or technical issues, or they were out of town, and so forth. So we felt like that our survey really did capture the full spectrum of extension professionals. And so from our perspective, that meant that we had a successful survey. And at this point, what I'll do is hand this off to Martha to talk about the results.
Thanks, Damian. So here we are. Here's the answer that the drum roll is providing. The 2,500 respondents that we got from across the Southeast, well, from those 8 states, mirror the general public in their response to these questions. They are all 6 Americas. And in fact, there's a skew toward the conservative side. So here the blue bars, oh wait, I need to get my little handy arrow here. The blue bars represent the United States General Survey that the other folks have done. This is in the literature from 2010. The red bars are our data, the Southeast Extension professionals. So we're extension only, and the United States is general public. That's one significant difference, plus the geographic difference. From what we know of the 6 Americas studies, they would have a skew to the right if they were only looking at the Southeast general public as well. And so at this point in time, we would say the extension people mirror the public only. I mean, that makes sense from what we know now. We dug deeper into the data to look at a little bit more, and here we've lined up the states are representing each column. The color bars are the 6 Americas, and they're lined up by this point, which is below this point people feel like they're either cautious, concerned, or alarmed about global warming. Above this line, they're disengaged, doubtful, and dismissive. So we've got about 50-50 in Mississippi and Texas, and we move over toward Virginia and Florida, where there are more people concerned and alarmed about climate change than the Southeast. This middle bar is our total response. And by people, I mean respondents to the survey, obviously, not the general public. We can explore a little bit more about why there might be differences by state. Because we asked people, move over here a little bar, a little arrow, we asked people what their political leaning was. Very conservative, conservative, moderate, liberal, very liberal. And this is highly correlated to the 6 Americas result. So here we show that the people who are very conservative and conservative are much more likely to be dismissive and doubtful about climate change. The people who are, well, we'll move this over to this side. The people who are liberal and very liberal are much more likely to be alarmed and concerned about climate change. And it turns out political leaning is not equally divided among all of our states when it comes to the extension population, because here we've maintained this x-axis as being the political leaning, and the color bars now refer to the states, not the 6 Americas. And here we can see that the very conservative people live all over the South, maybe more of them in Texas and Mississippi than some other places. But the liberal and very liberal extension respondents to this survey are not equally divided across all the states. There's a whole lot of them in Florida and a fair amount in Georgia as well, even North Carolina. So this gives us a little clue that there's more going on here than just listening to the science and understanding climate change. In fact, as we work through the demographics, there's a lot going on about who it is and how they feel about climate change. We also asked people what county they work in, and we took a map and identified which counties lie on the coastline and then which counties are other. So in this column we have all of our respondents, all 2,500 of them, and this column is only those people who work on the coast. And they are significantly more likely to be concerned and alarmed about climate change than people who work inland and than people who work in both inland and coastal counties. So we've got significant differences along all three. And of course Florida has a long coastline, so that is part of why Florida is a little bit different than everybody else. As we continue to work through this, we asked about age, and the age of the respondent pretty much doesn't make any difference unless they're over 60 years old, and then they're significantly more likely to be alarmed than the younger folks. Education also makes a difference, and this is a little bit confusing because one bar is for people who don't yet have a bachelor's degree. So these would be our extension respondents who may work in the counties as a program assistant, or they may be clerical administrative people, administrative clerical folks. The middle bar is having a bachelor's or a master's, and that's the enormous part of the respondents. And this bar is a PhD. So it's interesting to see that less than a bachelor's has people who are more concerned than people who do have a bachelor's or master's, but it's really this PhD group that is significantly more alarmed about the issues than the other folks that draws our attention. Moving right along, so that last idea about education leads us to think about who in extension has these opinions and ideas. Here again we have the color bars representing the 6 Americas categories, and across the x-axis we have people's responses to what they do in extension. Extension agents being the biggest part of the respondents, and they being a little bit less likely to be alarmed and concerned than some of the other folks. This bar is the average of all the respondents. Whenever you see Southeast, that's everybody. Here we have people who are state specialists and work in probably the main university as an extension faculty person. Here's administration. And beyond this, we have very small numbers, and it's harder to figure out exactly what relevance they have. Support staff may be clerical folks who don't actually give programs. Administrators like deans and program directors who don't give programs anymore. These are people who do give program, maybe they're program support in extension. Here's extension faculty, but they don't do programs. We affectionately refer to these people as perhaps looking for another job. And here's faculty who aren't even in extension, but somehow they're on this extension list, and so they responded to our survey as well. But the really important point here is that extension agents are here. These are county agents who work out in the state, and these are the state specialists who have a faculty position at the main university, and they're different. And we see that difference in these are the folks that have the PhDs, and these may not necessarily have PhDs. We also asked people to identify the top 3 areas that they tend to give programs in. We gave them lots and lots of choices, like livestock and nutrition and horticulture and 4-H. For this next slide, we took only their first priority area, and we looked at that across the 6 Americas. We combined program areas if they made sense to combine, like nutrition and health, and we kept them apart if they were significantly different in their response rate on 6 Americas. And so, here is the lineup. And let me point out that agriculture livestock people were significantly different than agriculture crops. So they form 2 bars, and the colors again are the 6 Americas differences. Here's the average, all of the Southeast respondents. Support staff and administrators we put together, since they don't have a program area, they don't really give programs. All the horticulture people combined into 1 bar. The 4-H people combined into 1 bar. The natural resources people split into 2 bars. Here we have marine, forestry, wood, and aquaculture. Here's the rest of the natural resources: freshwater, environmental education, and other. Community economic development and family community sciences were a little bit different from the food, nutrition, and health component of the family community sciences. And these 2 people differed mostly right here. There's a lot more people who are disengaged if they're in nutrition and health. The agriculture livestock folks, the agriculture together, but particularly the agriculture livestock, it's worthwhile to note that about 50% of them are doubtful and dismissive when it comes to global warming. Most of the Pine Map folks are right here. Our audience are the forestry folks, and they're bumping 50% in the alarmed and concerned group. If we switch over to the rest of the people in Extension who do natural resources, we have a significantly greater number of alarmed and concerned folks right here. So this begins to shed some light on who is our audience and how might we understand their perceptions so that we can develop program materials that serve them. If we look at those 2 natural resource groups together, they are significantly different from all of the folks in the Southeast. Here, this first bar is Southeast, and this bar is a combination of the 2 natural resources groups. They're more likely to be alarmed and concerned than everybody else. They're less likely, of course, to be cautious, disengaged, and dismissive. And they did, as I just mentioned, split into 2 bars. If we keep them together, we can start to understand why they might be a little bit different. There are more of the respondents in natural resources who are state specialists, and there's fewer of them than the rest of the respondents who are county agents. And so we know from the rest of our data that that alone is going to make a difference. It's part of what's going on when we have more of our natural resources people being liberal and moderate than the rest of the Southeast responses. It also makes a difference with education level because we have more of the natural resource people having a PhD than the respondents from the rest of the program areas. And more of our natural resource people work in, down here, work in the coastal area than everybody else in all the other respondents. So that gives you a little insight as to how important these other demographics are as we look at who is thinking what about climate change. The agriculture folks, who are more dismissive and more doubtful, are also more likely to be male. They represent more of the agents. They're more conservative when it comes to political leaning. And because they're more of the agents, there's also fewer of them have PhDs. And so these demographic characteristics are likely part of what's going on when we say the agriculture population is more likely to be dismissive and doubtful. So part of this is a function of who responded, and part of it is a function of who's out there. Okay, now this is a little bit different, and it's very important. You remember I said before, when it comes to this is where the arrows are right now, all the bars on the left-hand side. This is all what we've seen before. These are the groups divided by their first priority area. This bar is anybody who said forestry was a priority in their first, second, or third category. So this bar really is all the people who do forestry. Some of them are reported right here if they had their first priority as forestry, but the rest of them could be anywhere. Many of them probably are ag. They could be here in the rest of natural resources, or they could be in 4-H, not likely, but they could be. So this particular bar is everybody who thinks forestry is a priority area, either first, second, or third. And you can see that this group looks a lot like this group, the ag crops. They're a little bit more likely to be alarmed and concerned than ag livestock, but they are less concerned than the people who had forestry as their major component. So this really is the Pine Map audience, everybody out there who does forestry education. And if we look at this bar right across, that's the 50% mark. So 50% of them are cautious, concerned, and alarmed, and 50% of them are disengaged, doubtful, and dismissive. That's who we're talking to. There's a little bit more information that could be useful as we think about developing Pine Map materials, and that is that the extension faculty, meaning state specialists, as opposed to extension agents who are in the county, are more likely to perceive support for climate change programming from their institution. So this is greater than the average of all the extension respondents that we saw. And that's probably because the extension agents are mostly listening to county commissioners and their regional district director more than they're listening to the deans and the presidents of their universities. So they perceive different sources of support and different people when it comes to climate change. Okay, this one is a little bit complicated, so we'll take this one slowly. We had a long list of potential limits to climate change programming, and we asked people to what degree are these potential barriers real for you. The left, and there's 4 of these that we've identified as being of interest. So the lack of applied information is one barrier. The fact that there's conflicting information is another potential barrier. People might think the science is not sound, and that would be a barrier. And the lack of an audience interest is a potential barrier. For each of these 4 potential barriers, we've got 2 bars. The first one is all of the respondents, and the second one is just the people who responded that natural resources was their primary program area. And the first interesting thing is that, oops, got to click this, here we go. Natural resources and everybody else are pretty much the same when it comes to these 2 limitations, the lack of applied information and the lack of audience interest. So people working in natural resource areas are just like everybody else when it comes to saying, you know, not so many people care about climate change out there, so I'm not giving many programs. Or, I don't have specific information that tells me what climate change will do here on these things that we care about. So that's what they mean by applied information. And so that gives us important information about where Pine Map can provide information that will be useful to our audience. Another thing that's interesting is that in every single one of these limitations, the natural resources people are more likely to have an opinion and less likely to say they don't know, because blue is I don't know. So at least natural resources people are thinking about this, and they have some sense about programming in climate change. The third thing that is an interesting difference is that the natural resource people here and here are more likely to trust the science and tolerate conflicting information than the people who are in other areas of program areas, other areas of program. So that again gives us some clues about who we're talking to and what they're thinking and how we work with Pine Map information. We said in the very beginning, not the very beginning, but when we started looking at states, that Florida was a little bit odd because there were more people alarmed and concerned about climate change in Florida. So we looked at the Florida only. Here, this bar is the Florida only respondents, and here is comparing Florida to the rest of the Southeast. Interestingly, the Florida respondents are a significantly larger number of state faculty and a smaller number of county agents. And so that's going to set up a whole bunch of differences. One being the Florida respondents are more likely to have a PhD. Another being the people with PhDs and the people in major universities are more likely to be liberal. At least in the Florida response, we have more liberal folks responding. And because it's Florida, we have more people responding on the coast. So these demographic differences may explain why Florida is more alarmed and concerned than some of the other states. Other reasons also exist, and we can't determine that from these data. We've had a state specialist in climate change for a while here in Florida, and we have had a dean say this is important that we have climate change programming. So these are all pieces of the puzzle. Even though we have that many concerned and alarmed people in Florida, more than 50% of our respondents seldom or never use the terms global warming, climate change, or climate variability in their programs, which means they're not doing programs around climate change. 2/3 of them have never been to an in-service training on climate, but over 80% of them are at least willing to go to an in-service training on climate. So that's some of the things we can figure out from the data. And despite that willingness, we've got 17% don't know if global warming is happening. 39% say the scientific community has a political agenda. 35% are not worried. I'm assuming these people don't live on the coast, but we don't know. We can find out. And 82% need more information to make up their minds about global warming. So I take this to mean there's a lot of work we can do out there. There's lots of opportunities and there's lots of needs. There were 2 questions that asked people that gave people an opportunity to comment on this survey. And we're slowly working through the over 500 comments that we have gotten. And many of those comments come from people who are not concerned about climate change. They're doubtful or dismissive. And their comments help me understand where they're coming from and why they're thinking this way. And so I thought I'd share some of those with you. Some of these feelings are extremely strong. They are very adamant in their ideas that climate change is natural. People have not done anything about climate change, and it's part of God's plan. And if we trust God, everything will be just fine. They also, some of these people, believe the science is wrong. The scientists are wrong, and we cannot trust the science. And that's rather disturbing to me, because it's difficult to think about how we begin a conversation if we can't use the science. There's a fair amount of people who are concerned and afraid that if we do something to address climate change, we'll be affecting our economic productivity and particularly agricultural productivity. So the economy will be disadvantaged by climate policies. And they say things, this is more than one person, they say things like, This is an international issue, and it shouldn't be just the United States leading everybody else in addressing climate change. I won't make any more comments about that. Here are some other things that they think. The scientists are making this up because they want research funding to write articles. And it's all scientists making it up and the media having a heyday and political people going off the deep end with climate change. They think that it's arrogant to believe that people can change the climate. And in fact, climate is always changing. We don't live in an ice age anymore, and so that's all the evidence we need that climate change is natural. That's not everybody. There are some respondents who are practical, and they say no matter what's going on with climate, it's still smart to reduce our footprint and conserve our resources. And they might say that because they know their audiences won't want to talk about climate, but we should still be looking at energy conservation. And some folks just plainly admit that they don't know and they want more information in order to figure it out. A few people also had comments that were very hopeful. They said, people trust extension, people believe what extension says, and if the extension message is, this is the science about climate, people might listen to it. And the people who have a youth education orientation were definitely thinking that youth are interested in this topic and they could use information about climate. So in terms of wrapping this up, the summary is that extension professionals are like the public. They fall into all 6 categories. The differences between extension and the public probably have to do with demographic factors, and some of those demographic factors like political leaning, gender, state, coastline, and education are strongly linked to perceptions on climate change. Within extension, we see differences in terms of the role, agents versus state specialists, and program area, agriculture, for example, and natural resources. We see that perceptions of what limits people's ability to do programming around climate change includes lack of applied information and the perception of audience interest. When it comes to PineMap, Extension has always said we're successful because we're similar to our audiences. And when it comes to climate change, we do reflect the public at large. And this may create challenges for us at PineMap in terms of reaching these extension agents who are really like the public. The people who are most interested to engage in climate change, and I'm thinking those are the people who are alarmed and concerned, may actually be the least likely to be heard by the general public unless PineMap can teach them how to be heard. So that may be one thing that we could talk about in the time that we would like to be talking about this. It could also be that the people who are concerned and cautious and doubtful are more able to communicate effectively to the public because the public is concerned and cautious and doubtful. So we should think about that. If those doubtful and dismissive agents are the best able to reach the public, what would they say? And some of the respondents in the survey were dismissive about climate change and global warming, and they said in their comments they wanted to give the real facts, and so and I'm sure that those were not the facts we would agree with. And so working with these folks could be a challenge. But given the number of people in agriculture and forestry who are doubtful and dismissive, we probably can't afford to ignore them or wait for them to eventually reach the same conclusions that we've reached. We probably need to engage them and work with them. And how can we do that? Certainly there's some folks who think that we can skip right over climate as an issue and speak directly to the impacts. And that can work. That may be the best way to hook people, but the question is, where do we go from there? And if that's all we do, would we be building trust if they ask us, well, are we really talking about climate or not? And so I think that's another question that we can talk about. Within PineMap, we certainly have an opportunity to work with long-term professional development across our southern states. We don't need to limit ourselves to the hook that gets their attention. So what would a longer professional development program look like? And ultimately, what's the best way to engage extension professionals in understanding and then communicating the risks and impacts and mitigation and adaptation strategies for climate change? So that concludes what we have presented, and I'm happy to go back to any of these questions